Good morning and welcome to the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah, for the final session of our 2021 annual First Amendment Conference entitled Looking Forward, Religious Liberty Under a New Court. I'm Kiana McAllister. I'm the student lead on the Quill Project, our center's research partnership with the University of Oxford. Speaking on behalf of my colleagues, we are thrilled to spend these 2 days with you considering pressing issues of religious liberty and how these issues may be affected by the new U.S. Supreme Court. Now, please allow me a few words of introduction and acknowledgement. Organized in 2011, the Center for Constitutional Studies is a nonpartisan academic institute that promotes the instruction, study, and research of constitutionalism. Our mission is to increase constitutional literacy in our local, state, and national communities in a nonpartisan manner. Speaking on behalf of all my colleagues, I express gratitude to UVU Provost Dr. Wayne Vaught and UVU President Dr. Astrid Jimenez for their support of our center. I also thank the members of our advisory board for their invaluable guidance. Several of them were especially helpful in developing this conference. I hope you've been able to enjoy the first 4 sessions of the conference. If you've missed any of them, check back next week at uvu.edu/ccs/events or on this YouTube channel for recordings of the sessions of this conference. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of this session. Dr. Brian Birch is director of the Center for the Study of Ethics and Religious Studies program at Utah Valley University. His areas of specialization include religious diversity, comparative theological studies, and the dynamics of religion in civil society. He has served on the Board of Trustees and the Executive Committee for the Parliament of the World's Religions and is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. He is the founding editor of the journal Teaching Ethics, and his published work includes contributions to the Encyclopedia of Religion and War, Philosophical Investigations, and Dialogue. His book projects include titles ranging from What is Postmodernism to Perspectives on Mormon Theology. His current project is entitled Radical Pluralism, Essays in Ethical and Religious Diversity. Dr. Birch, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kiana. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to be part of this session, and I would like to extend my congratulations to you and to all of those associated with this event. It's really terrific, and it's been a great couple of days. This is the final session of the conference, and we're privileged to hear from 2 remarkable presenters, both of whom I think would consider themselves friends to UVU and to the Center for Constitutional Studies. We certainly consider them friends and appreciate all they have done to enrich our university. We will first hear from Dr. Phillip Muñoz. He will present remarks entitled Religious Freedom Issues on the Horizon for the Court, after which we will hear from Judge Thomas Griffith, whose remarks are entitled Moving Forward with Civility. I will introduce each of them, and then they will present in turn, and then we will spend the remainder of our time with questions. Dr. Muñoz is the Tocqueville Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame. He is the founding director of Notre Dame's minor in Constitutional Studies and also directs the university's Tocqueville program for inquiry into religion and public life. Dr. Muñoz writes and teaches across fields of constitutional law, American politics, and political philosophy, with a focus on religious liberty and the American founding. His first book, God and the Founders, won the Hubert Morkin Award from the American Political Science Association for Best Book in 2009 and 2010. More recently, in 2019, he joined the editorial team of American Constitutional Law, which I learned is the leading publication for constitutional law casebooks designed for undergraduate instruction, and that publication is now in its 11th edition. Dr. Muñoz has spoken at over 75 colleges and universities, notably including UVU. He received his BA from Claremont McKenna College, his MA from Boston College, and his PhD from Claremont Graduate School. And I must note that I am all the more honored to be in a session with a fellow alumnus from Claremont. So welcome back to UVU, Dr. Muñoz. Thomas Griffith was appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit by President George W. Bush in 2005. He served in this capacity until his retirement from the bench this past year. Judge Griffith graduated from Brigham Young University and the University of Virginia Law School. At the time of his appointment to the DC Circuit, he was general counsel for BYU, and prior to this served as legal counsel to the United States Senate, which some of you know is the nonpartisan chief legal officer for this body. He was also a litigation partner at the law firm of Wiley, Rain, and Fielding in Washington, D.C. Judge Griffith is currently a lecturer at Harvard Law School, special counsel at the law firm of Hunton Andrews Kurth, and a senior policy advisor at the National Institute for Civil Discourse. So welcome back to you, Tom. It's great to have both of you here for this conference. As I mentioned, we'll hear from both of our speakers in turn. We'll spend the remainder of time engaging with interesting questions, we hope. And so without further ado, we will turn the virtual lectern over to Dr. Muñoz.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Berth. It's a real honor and pleasure to be on the panel with Judge Griffith. And thank you, Kiana, too, for the serving as our moderator here. I am extraordinarily pleased to have been invited to participate in this conference on the future of the First Amendment. I want to thank the organizers. Also want to take a moment to pause and thank the leadership, recognize the leadership of UVU and the university's benefactors for supporting the Center for Constitutional Studies. I run a similar program here at Notre Dame, and I truly believe that knowledge of our constitutional principles, our constitution structure, knowledge of the rights the Constitution is meant to protect, this knowledge is essential if we are to maintain our constitutional republic. So conferences like this one, the education of the public more generally about the Constitution, these are vital components of our system of government and essential tasks for higher education. So I just want to commend UVU on taking a leading role in this civic task. And I'm delighted to be at UVU again, even though I very much wish I could be there in person. She'll be mad at me for saying this, but my niece is one of the assistant coaches on the volleyball team. So I have a special connection to UVU. Okay, I've been asked to share a few reflections on religious freedom issues on the horizon for the Supreme Court. I was particularly pleased to have been invited to speak on this theme, as it's really candidly not my area of expertise. I tend to look backwards in time. I'm a scholar of the American founding and of the original meaning and natural rights principles that originally animated the First Amendment. So I welcome the opportunity to look forward. I want to admit that someone perhaps who's more involved in the day-to-day business of constitutional litigation could better tell us about particular cases that are going to come before the court. So I thought I might approach the subject in a slightly different way. Rather than look at cases in the pipeline or likely to be put in the pipeline, I thought I might step back and try to point out some big issues that the court might take up, should it choose to do so. This is speculative on my part. In a way, it's kind of like what I'd like to see the court, questions I would like to see the court answer. So I've organized my presentation here around two questions each for the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. And I'll start with the Free Exercise Clause. Here's my first question. Will the Supreme Court overturn Employment Division versus Smith? Given the current Fulton case, and there's been lots of discussion at this conference on this case, but given the current case, will the court overturn the Smith decision? I don't think the court will overturn Smith in this case. I think that in part because the court could decide for the religious appellants without actually overturning Smith. But even if Smith is not overturned this year, there's going to be calls for the Smith decision to be overturned in subsequent cases. So my question, will the Supreme Court overturn Smith sooner or later? There might be added political incentive to do so. Things have changed for religious freedom in America. Let me point out two things. First, and this has been much remarked at by social scientists, the collapse of the traditional religious character of the American people and the corresponding rise of the nuns, not Catholic nuns, but nuns, N-O-N-E-S, that is those who do not identify as religious or affiliate with the church. The nuns, this demographic part of America is growing rapidly, and this fact has been much commented on, so much so that I think it's actually fair to call America, at least our culture right now, we're entering into a post-Christian era. Okay, so we have a demographic fact that the context of religious freedom is different now in America. The second contextual fact, the Equality Act. This is the non-discrimination legislation that has passed the House and is currently being debated in the Senate. The version that passed the House explicitly trumps the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You probably know this already, but the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act significantly mitigated the effects of the Smith decision, at least on the federal level. The protections that religious citizens lost in Smith were largely restored by RFRA. That's why it's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The act was designed in its author's intentions to restore religious freedom. That is to go back to the pre-Smith understanding of religious freedom. The mainstream Democratic left no longer supports RFRA. And RFRA protections are now seen by many progressives as regressive, as unjust and discriminatory. And hence, when the progressive left is in control of the government, as it is now, RFRA will be targeted for limitation. This is what's happening in the Equality Act. If the Equality Act it is passed, at least in the context of the protections afforded by the Equality Act, RFRA is superseded. It would not surprise me if eventually those on the left called for RFRA's repeal entirely. Okay, for the Supreme Court, this means that the Smith precedent becomes even more consequential. If the Supreme Court does not overturn Smith, religious citizens will, I think sooner or later, likely lose the protections for religious freedom that they have been accustomed to, that they've had for most of the last 30 years and prior to Smith, 30 years before that. So there may be political reasons now to overturn Smith that did not exist before. Okay, my second question. If the Supreme Court does overturn Smith, how will it do so? This is a little bit of inside baseball, but I thought I might point it out anyways. My question is really, what reasoning will the court use if it overturns Smith? The court's conservatives right now are the justices most likely to overturn Smith. They are also, in general, sympathetic to what's known as originalism, a constitutional philosophy of interpreting the Constitution according to its original meaning. But here's the problem. It's by no means clear that the original meaning of the Free Exercise Clause is inconsistent with Smith. There's lots of originalist criticism of the Smith decision, but that criticism overlooks the fact or forgets the fact that Justice Scalia provided an originalist defense of Smith in the 1997 case, City of Burney versus Flores. Now, Justice Scalia may be right or he may be wrong. Leading originalist scholars are divided on the question of whether the Free Exercise Clause, its original meaning, affords a constitutional right to exemptions. But there are leading scholars who say Smith was, leading originalist scholars, and I'm thinking here primarily of Phillip Hamburger at Columbia, arguably the most distinguished conservative legal historian in the legal academy. There are leading constitutional scholars that say Smith was rightly decided on originalist grounds. Now there are leading scholars, and I'm thinking here now of Michael McConnell at Stanford Law School, who say Smith was wrongly decided on originalist grounds. I don't know that the court can rely on originalism given the scholarly dispute. So if the court's originalists overturn Smith, how will they do so? I don't know. I'm very curious to see. Okay, let me shift to the Establishment Clause. My first Establishment Clause question is, will the current court overturn Lemon v. Kurtzman or any of its progeny, including the endorsement test? The Lemon test has been called a lemon by conservatives for, probably 50 years. Lemon is a three-part test invented by the court in 1971 to enforce the no establishment provision of the First Amendment. The test, you probably know this if you're watching, but the test says for law to be constitutional, a law must have a secular legislative purpose. The primary effects of the law can neither advance nor inhibit religion, and the law cannot cause an excessive entanglement between religion and the government. And to be constitutional, a law has to pass all three prongs of the test. Justice O'Connor, in a series of decisions starting in the 1980s, modified or transformed Lemon into what's known as the endorsement test. That is, government cannot constitutionally endorse religion. Now, critics have long argued that these tests don't match the Constitution's text. In an obvious sense, the First Amendment prohibits an establishment of religion. It doesn't prohibit endorsements of religion. Critics have long argued that these tests do not capture the Establishment Clause's original meaning. And here, the original scholars are agreed. These tests are a departure from the Constitution's original meaning. But there's never been 5 votes to overturn either the endorsement rationale or the Lemon test. With Justice Barrett on the court, there now may be. We have Justice Barrett, Justice Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. I can count to 5. And I've left out Justice Roberts. So I don't know whether the Lemon test or the endorsement test will be explicitly overturned, but it's now possible in a way that it hasn't been possible in the past. So we shall see. Okay, this brings me to my next and final question. Who will be the dominant justice in Establishment Clause jurisprudence? For about 20 years, Justice O'Connor was the 5th and deciding vote on Establishment Clause matters. In more recent years, it seems to be Chief Justice Roberts, that he's held the central position. With the court's new composition, that is with the addition of Justice Barrett and Justice Ginsburg's departure, rest her soul, a new 5-member majority can be formed without Justice Roberts. So who's going to dominate that 5-member majority? Will there be one justice that dominates? I'm not sure. There's an interesting split among the court conservatives on the Establishment Clause. And we saw this last term in the case Espinoza versus Montana. In that case, the court found unconstitutional the application of a Montana state constitutional provision that effectively excluded religious individuals from participating in a state-funded scholarship program. The court, in an opinion drafted by Justice Roberts, said that disqualifying otherwise eligible recipients from a public benefit solely because of their religious character imposes a penalty on the free exercise of religion. And he said that triggers strict scrutiny, and then in the case, they struck down the application of the Montana Blaine Amendment. Now, Justice Thomas agreed with the outcome of the case, but he took a very different approach to the case than did Chief Justice Roberts. Justice Thomas wrote a sharp concurring opinion, which was joined by Justice Gorsuch, and he declared, that is, Justice Thomas declared that in his view, the court's Establishment Clause precedents, going all the way back to Everson versus Board of Education, 1947 case, all these precedents were unmoored from the original meaning of the First Amendment and therefore should be overturned. In a series of opinions dating back at least 20 years, Justice Thomas has argued that the original meaning of the Establishment Clause primarily concerned federalism. That is, the original purpose of the Establishment Clause was to protect the states against federal encroachment in their ability to establish or not establish a religion. So to apply the Establishment Clause against the states, Justice Thomas says, is a constitutional mistake. The logical implication of Justice Thomas's position is the disincorporation of the Establishment Clause. As far as I know, No provision in the Bill of Rights has ever been disincorporated. If Justice Thomas had his way, states would be free to aid religion or not, subject only to the restrictions imposed by their own state constitutions. So let me summarize. Justice Thomas basically would overturn every major Supreme Court Establishment Clause precedent. Justice Roberts, by contrast, seems unwilling to overturn any precedents. So my question, which justice will dominate the Establishment Clause? Will it be Roberts? Will it be Thomas? Or will it be Barrett or Alito or Gorsuch or Kavanaugh? We could have a very different Establishment Clause jurisprudence in the very near future. Only time will tell. Okay, these are just some of the questions I think are before the court. I've probably gone long enough, and I'm eager to hear Judge Griffith. So let me conclude again by thanking UVU's Center for Constitutional Studies, and I very much look forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Professor. That was fascinating. And the audience doesn't need to hear this, but I'll say it anyway. You want to find everything that Professor Muñoz has written about the religion clause of the Constitution. His work is groundbreaking, important, and it's an honor to be on the same panel with him. Thank you to the organizers of the conference. Thank you, Kiana, for the great work you've done and others have done. And Professor Birch, thank you for that introduction. As the last speaker, I wish I could sound a more optimistic note, but I'm going to start off as a bit of a downer here. Maybe it's my age, 66 years old. Maybe I've turned into a cranky old man who tells young people to get off the grass. But I'm deeply concerned about the present state of American political society and whether we have the capacity in our present state to strike the types of accommodations that will be necessary to guarantee a robust protection of the religion clauses, as well as to guarantee a robust protection of equality principles that are so central to our republic. So I'm worried about that. So let me start. I have a book that I'd highly recommend. I guess you can't see it really well. I don't have a share screen. I don't know how to do share screen yet. So Political Tribes by Professor Amy Chua of Yale Law School. Professor Chua published this book a couple years ago. She tells an interesting story in the research and writing the book. She started the book as an effort, as a critique of American foreign policy. And the idea that she wanted to explore was that American foreign policy makers had not taken adequate account of political tribalism in nations where there was some American intervention. She was going to look at Southeast Asia, going to look at Iraq, and different places around the world where American foreign policy had intervened, and critique that because they hadn't taken account of the political tribalism that divided those countries. She put together a matrix of factors to determine whether tribalism had beset a nation. And as she was doing the research and put together this matrix, she came to the rather sober realization that the matrix she created, when applied to her own country, the United States of America, showed that political tribalism existed here, maybe even was dominant. A sober note to begin with. I also want to start with Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. I don't think anyone would accuse Jonathan Haidt of being apocalyptic in his approach. Yet listen to what he said just 2 years ago. There is a very good chance that in the next 30 years, we will have a catastrophic failure of our democracy. We just don't know what a democracy looks like when you drain all trust out of the system. So I'm neither a scholar nor a pundit, but I'm an observer. I'm a creature of Washington, D.C. It's where most of my professional life was spent, and I'm a junkie. I listen to C-SPAN radio. You didn't know there was a C-SPAN radio but political junkies do. So with that qualification, let me give you my observation. I don't believe there's been a more perilous moment in my lifetime for our republic than the moment we face right now, because of the warning Professor Haight delivered. We just don't know what happens to a democracy when all trust is drained out of the system. I think we live in that moment now where most of the trust is drained. And so I worry. I worry about our ability to protect religious liberty, to protect equality. So what to do? What to do about the problem? Well, at a minimum, we should act civilly, right? We should carry on our debates civilly. I like this from Peter Weiner. Weiner writes, civility has to do with the respect we owe others as fellow human beings. It establishes limits so we don't treat opponents as enemies. It's a good start. Civility is a good start. Arthur Brooks observes, however, that if he were to tell you that he and his wife were civil one to another, your response would be, get some counseling, right? Civility is the floor, but it's not enough. It's not enough at this present moment. And so I'd like to rely on a work of scholarship by former Utah Valley University President Matthew Holland, Bonds of Affection. It's titled Civic Charity and the Making of America. It's a fabulous book. I'd highly recommend it. I have a copy of it here as well. Bonds of Affection by President Holland. Professor Holland's thesis is he takes this idea that's part of the American DNA that he calls civic charity, and he traces it from the Massachusetts Bay Colony right on through to Lincoln's 2 inaugural addresses. And the point and he even includes Thomas Jefferson's inaugural address after the bitter election of 1800 has these themes of civic charity. They're best characterized in Lincoln's 2 inaugurals. In the first inaugural, we know he famously said, remember, this is when 7 states have seceded from the Union. The project seems to be on the verge of failure, and Lincoln pled with his fellow citizens. We know these words; they're canonical in American politics. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Then 4 years later, at his second inaugural, on the verge of victory in the Civil War, when Lincoln and the United States had every right, seemingly, to be the conquerors, to crush the rebellious Confederacy. Instead, these are the words Lincoln uttered: with malice towards none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds. So Matt Holland's book traces this idea of civic charity, and argues that it was indispensable in the making of America, and then argues it ought to be critical in the project to this day. So what I'd like to do is take that concept, and I'd like to drill down on an event in American history that I think illuminates the importance of civic charity, as well as giving us insights into how the Constitution is intended to work. And I'm going to go back to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. I'm going to rely on the scholarship of a young scholar named Derek Webb, who studied under Professor and former Judge Michael McConnell at Stanford. Webb drills down into the small group dynamics that characterized the success of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. He starts with July, and as we know, in July, things weren't looking too well. The convention was on the brink of failure. There was talk of dissolution. Some of the delegates were packing their bags, ready to head out. Things weren't looking good. And yet by September, 7 or 8 weeks later, they had achieved success. In transmitting the Constitution to the Congress, this is what George Washington wrote about their success. He wrote, "The Constitution is the result of the spirit of amity and mutual deference which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. The spirit of amity, the spirit of mutual deference, which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. Derek Webb does a deep dive to try and figure out how did the convention create that spirit of amity and mutual deference. And he has a couple of suggestions, some insights that I think are valuable for us as understanding history, and I think even more importantly for our present moment. First of all, he looks at the rules of the convention. And the rules of the convention were designed to do at least two things. First was to get the delegates to pay attention to one another. Attendance was mandatory. If you were in Philadelphia, you had to be there. Second, when the floor was held, no talking was allowed, no reading was allowed, no working was allowed. In other words, the value that was intended to be captured by these rules were we are going to listen seriously to one another. The second set of rules created an atmosphere, a space, we would say today, where the delegates felt the freedom to change their views. As we know, the proceedings were in secret. There was no media covering what they were doing. There was no official record of votes taken. So a delegate could take a position in late May and change his view a couple of months later when that issue was revisited without any fear of being called a flip-flopper. Again, the idea was we're going to have a discussion. People are going to listen to one another, and you're going to be able to change your mind. That's the purpose of deliberation. That's the purpose of discussion. So that's the first thing that Derek Webb looks at, is the rules of the convention and how they were intended to encourage, may even force deliberation and consultation. The second factor he looks at is even more interesting, I think, and that is the degree of sociality which the delegates experienced among one another. First of all, start with the idea that even though it was a large city for its time, Philadelphia was a pretty small place. Not a lot of boarding houses or taverns that could accommodate the work of the convention. And so the delegates were housed together in this small city, sometimes sleeping in the same bed with one another, doubling up and tripling up in rooms. They got to know each other quite well by having to live with each other in such close quarters. The typical week of a convention, they would meet at 10 in the morning and work till 3 or 4 in the afternoon in session, Mondays through Saturdays. And then they would break and they would go eat. And then they would have tea afterwards in the evening. Same thing happened with the eating arrangements. There weren't that many taverns available. And so they ended up eating together. And within a couple of weeks of the convention starting, they formed dinner groups. And now these dinner groups weren't formed along ideological lines or even regional lines. It turns out that they would have dinner with people that they hadn't known before from different parts of the country, different regional interests. And then at key moments during the summer, Benjamin Franklin, who lived in Philadelphia and had a rather nice home, would throw a lavish party with the best food that he could find. Libations flowed freely. There was a great deal of good humor and fun and loud laughter. George Mason wrote of this combination of sociality. He said, "We grew into some acquaintance with each other and formed a proper correspondence of sentiments." We would phrase that as they got to know each other. They became friends. So the key moment of the convention, according to Webb, it occurs in July when things are looking dark, like the convention is not going to succeed. A critical decision was made by the delegates. And that decision was that they were going to come up with a compromise. They were going to come up with a compromise so that the conventions would succeed, a constitution would be created, and a republic could be formed. 11 moderates were chosen to meet and hash out this compromise. And they did so in Franklin's home, once again. Small group dynamics among people who had gotten to know each other and could call one another friends. Now, here's the lesson. Here's the takeaway from Derek Webb's scholarship. The delegates at the Philadelphia Convention agreed to compromise for the sake of union before they knew the terms of the compromise. That's an example of civic charity. The most fundamental impulse that created the Constitution of 1787 was the desire to create a union with those of different views. That, I believe, is a fundamental insight into the creation of the Constitution and to its survival. Michael Gerson writes, "The heroes of America are heroes of unity. Our Constitution is designed for vigorous disagreement. It is not designed for irreconcilable contempt." The Constitution itself was born in compromise. Both sides sought convergence where neither side sought total victory. Compromise looks for ways to accommodate the legitimate concerns of the other. We remember the words of Martin Luther King, who said, "Our purpose is not to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding." That's civic charity. That's how the Constitution was created. The most dominant theme of the Federalist Papers is a warning about the danger of extreme partisanship. 55 of the 85 Federalist Papers were concerned about partisanship. And perhaps the most influential of the papers, Madison's, number 10, he observed that extreme partisanship was the main reason republics failed in the past. So here's my pitch. That's all the wind up for this pitch. If you want to support and defend the Constitution, which all civil officers and military officers take an oath to do, all members of the bar take an oath to do, and hopefully all citizens of the United States have a desire to do, to support and defend the Constitution, here's the primary way you can do that. Commit to work for unity. Be an agent of reconciliation. Don't be an agent of division. And maybe when we get into question and answers, I can tell you some of my thoughts about how one becomes an agent of division as opposed to an agent of reconciliation. So let me finish with this. How does civic charity, this idea, work? You showed how it worked back in Philadelphia in 1787. How does it work today, particularly in the tug and the pull between religious liberty and equality? Both key values we want to protect and defend in our republic. I'm going to rely on the scholarship and the work of the former dean of Harvard Law School, a political progressive, Martha Minow. Dean Minow, for years, has written about the importance of compromise. That compromise in this area, in the tug and pull between religious liberty and equality, that compromise can allow the type of accommodation that she argues is actually indispensable for stability in a diverse society. She writes, attitudes of respect, flexibility, and humility can help generate new answers beyond exemption and no exemption when religious principles and civil rights collide. Dean Minow points out, humility involves restraint and making room for open and respectful exploration of the other point of view. She also points out that the most likely agents to reach such a compromise are not judges. It's not litigation. It's through the political actors, through politicians and government actors who can strike accommodations and compromise. I'm speaking at an event sponsored in Utah. I can't help but observe that's the home of the Utah Compromise. The Washington Post account of the Utah Compromise records that it was the result of meetings held in the homes of negotiators. Apparently, the negotiations started out in a law firm office around a conference table in a very Utah way. It went to the homes of the negotiators soon. And that setting helped, according to the Post, helped create enduring and emotional friendships. And these personal connections of trust and friendship were made across what had been thought to be an unbridgeable divide. In the words of George Washington, the Utah Compromise was the result of the spirit of amity and mutual deference, which the peculiarities of the political situation rendered indispensable. I believe we're in such a moment now. We are polarized as we have never been since the Civil War. It's hard work to forge compromise. It requires a self-awareness and a self-honesty, that I realize that there are things that I have to give up. There are things that I have to give up to be able to live in unity with others who have different interests. Now, obviously, there's got to be some line. Can't give up everything, right? But I can probably give up a lot more than I thought I could for the sake of unity. That's the spirit of civic charity. That's hard work. But you know what? We can do hard things. Thank you.
Many thanks for both of those presentations. There's a lot to talk about. We have approximately 20 minutes for questions. These are coming into me via chat, so I will pose one to begin. One of our observers would like to know a little bit more about the Equality Act, and specifically what provisions in the Equality Act have or present the most concern for religious freedom issues.
Judge, do you want to take that, or are you?
No, you're the expert there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say that that was just a terrific presentation by Judge Griffith. Really fantastic. We need you back on the bench. You shouldn't have retired. I think from the perspective of religious liberty, and I haven't read through the entire Equality Act, but as it's been reported, the House version has a explicit textual provision that says, as related to this act, I'm paraphrasing here, as related to this act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is basically inapplicable. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act does not cover you as applied to the provisions of this act. The Equality Act, again, I'm relying on news accounts of this, also expands the notion of what a public accommodation is. So it encompasses more and more of what used to be the private sphere into its scope.
Brian, can I pitch in?
Please do.
So I finished with this note borrowing from Dean Minow. By the way, that's a trick that political conservatives always do, right? We quote our friends who are political progressives, but I do so with her permission. She understands. In fact, I just wrote her today saying, "I'm doing it again, Martha. I'm going to quote you again." But I think the discussion of the Equality Act drives home a point she's trying to make, and with which I agree. Look, there are times when you need to litigate, right? I mean, if your constitutional or statutory rights are being infringed and you haven't been able to have a redress of grievances through the political process, no, you go to the courts. But the courts just are not well equipped to handle these competing claims. And the political branches are. But here's the problem. The political branches right now are at each other's throats, right? And to me, that's the problem. You know, I don't do politics real well, but it seems to me there are plenty of deals that ought to be able to be struck here, right? Between the legitimate claims of the LGBTQ community, for example, and the legitimate claims of religious adherence. We ought to be able to come up with some sort of solution there. If both sides are willing to compromise because they genuinely want to live in a community with others. And see, that's the problem, right? We've got, and I'm not a sociologist, but increasingly we see people retreating to their own communities, intentional communities where they don't want to be with others. I think that's a problem. I think that's a danger.
Brian, can I raise a question here? More just to have a bit of a conversation with the judge. I'm curious to ask the judge. I mean, one compromise would be to actually increase the private sphere, live and let live. And we typically think, and I think the spirit of your comments was, well, exemptions are a way to compromise. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit skeptical of that. Exemptions are a way to polarize in a way. Madison's scheme for compromising was basically no law should be passed unless the law can apply to everyone. And if you can't pass a law that everyone would be happy to be under, don't pass a law at all. And so an older way of compromising was sort of, I mean, this was religious. Let's not establish a religion. Let everyone, let's take religious establishments out of the government. Let's not establish a sexual morality. Let's just leave each other alone. That actually strikes me as the older understanding of compromise, to demand less of politics.
That could be a very fruitful line of inquiry. I'm using the exemption, no exemption, because that's what the courts have created, right? That's an example, I think, of judicial overreach here. But yeah, you're the political scientist. You come up with better ways than I could have. But the key is, to me, that I have to be willing to want to be in community with people who have very different views than I do, and that can't. I gotta be willing to do that, and vice versa, right? Now, whether you do it as a matter of exemption or in your sort of Madisonian view, I'm not. Both seem fine to me. Both seem fine to me.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really possible today, but I mean, one way to live and be in community is actually live and let live. Yeah. And don't use the force of law to coerce anyone. Just leave people alone.
Now you're edging me into a libertarianism that I don't know.
We should get back to the regular.
Okay, no, that's good.
Great discussion. So for you, Judge Griffith, the questioner says, how do you feel civic charity would change or impact the conflict that exists in religious liberty claims, and especially at the level of the Supreme Court?
Well, this isn't something for the Supreme Court to do. The Supreme Court needs to construe the law and apply it, right? This claim for civic charity is more about the citizenry, right, and our elected representatives, what we want and demand and expect of our elected representatives. That's where that really comes into play. And I think where it works is you end up compromising. I have a certain set of interests that I think are vital, and I think civic charity suggests that, well, maybe I ought to be a little bit more introspective and say, you can't have everything, Tom. You can't have the world just the way you want it, because you live in a pluralistic, diverse society. Now, if you don't want the pluralistic, diverse society, this is going to sound harsh, well, you go buy a desert island somewhere, right? Or, but no, we live in a pluralistic, diverse society. We're committed to that. And that means to make it work, you've got to give up some stuff. Now it's got to be two sides. It's got to be two ways, right? It's got to be two ways. Both sides need to stop weaponizing their beliefs and look for ways to accommodate one another. That as I say that, and I give this talk a lot, it just sounds so naive at times, right? It just sounds so like, what world are you living in? But I take some comfort from the fact that there are a lot of people who are arguing this. This is just Arthur Brooks and David Brooks and others making this point from the center right, that we have to find ways to accommodate. I gave an early version of this talk a number of years ago, and in a very hostile environment, Yale Law School, and it was not well received for the following reason. I did not understand then that civility can be a code word for shut up, right? For marginalized groups to shut up. And so I want to stress that I don't think that's what I'm talking about. No, people need to speak up. People need to speak up. These are important issues. They're issues involving our own identity. It's just that when we speak up and the way we speak up, we can't do so out of contempt, right? And then the final point is, and you got to be prepared to compromise. You got to be prepared to compromise. If MAGA supporters can't imagine living in the same community as Bernie Sanders supporters, or vice versa, there's the problem. There's the problem. David Brooks says this, and I love this. He said, "I have never lost a friend over politics. They're not that important." Look, politics are important, but we can't use them in contempt. That's the point. Can't be contemptuous.
Well said. Dr. Muñoz, do you have anything to add?
No. I mean, I think candidly, I should just be quiet and we should listen to Judge Griffith. This is terrific.
Not true at all. Not true at all. Okay, our next question comes in from Scott Paul, and it says, what are the 21st century equivalents to the 1787 dinner groups where the ideologically unaligned can grow in acquaintance? And Tom, you mentioned one example that we'd like to hear more on that if you would like to share.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. And so now I'm going to take a long bow and aim it at my fellow citizens. Okay, here's a problem. It may not realize this. This may be sort of an example of unintended consequences. Congress can't vote themselves a pay raise, right? What happens when Congress votes themselves a pay raise? They get primaried, they get challenged. People back home saying, "Oh, they're elite," so they don't do it. So as a result of that, most congressmen cannot afford to live in the Washington, D.C. area. Because if they sell their home back in Indiana and buy a place in Washington, they've gone native, right? And they get primaried. So the result of it, I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. My parents were government workers. We were fine. We weren't wealthy. But I went to school, to public schools, with the sons and daughters of congressmen and senators and Supreme Court justices. We weren't special. That was just that's the way things were. Go to a Little League game, there's a Supreme Court justice there, right? Go to PTA, there's a congressman there. Now, the point is, they got to know each other. They congressmen and senators got to know each other then. And it's once you get to know somebody, typically, it's really hard to hate them. And sometimes it's not, but it's hard to hate them. But right now, the typical congressman or senator flies in to Washington Tuesday morning. They do their business Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then they fly out Thursday because they got to go back home, because if they don't go back home, they're going to get primaried. They can't afford to live in DC. So they live in these awful these terrible places. At one point, I've forgotten the number, but I think at one point it was like 30 or 40% of the members of the House of Representatives live in their office, and shower in the House. This is absurd. They don't know each other. I heard Senator Chris Coons once say at a lunch with the judges on my court that the only time he gets to interact with people across the aisle is at Bible study on the Senate Bible study on Wednesday, and then running into them at the gym. The point is, they don't know each other, and it's easy to go on Fox News or MSNBC and say horrible things about others. I've taken too long with that, but that's what there are proposals to build a dormitory on Capitol. Not going to go anywhere. Build a dormitory on Capitol Hill, and you got to live there and get to know each other. That's not going to happen, but it underscores the point, at least at Congress.
Can I just add something here? One thought. The 21st century equivalent of the 1789 dinner party is certainly not Twitter or any social media. maybe one of the equivalents, or I mean, first of all, just the dinner party. that's just inviting people in your homes, actually talking to neighbors, people you disagree with. But one place where we actually are supposed to do this is on our college campuses. And I'm really troubled. There's even here at Notre Dame, a trend where there are sort of, if you're a political liberal, you take these sorts of courses, and a political conservative, you take these sorts of courses. And that's just terrible. We need to have small seminars with students who disagree, have robust discussion and debate. The best thing that ever happened to me when I was in college, my sophomore year, my roommate was a committed Marxist. And I thought he had crazy ideas, but he was a great guy. And we stayed up very late talking. I had in college friends all across the political spectrum, and they're still very good friends today. And I don't think that's so true for young people now, that they group by political affiliation in their friendships. And I suppose I can understand why that happens, but it's, I think, really unfortunate. Because exactly what the judge said, it's you can disagree with someone. In fact, you can have the best disagreements with your friends, but there's got to be that underlying friendship. And that civic friendship is desperately needed today. And the place we can teach it is actually college campuses.
Amen. Yeah, what's happening in higher education on the free speech front is stunning and shocking to someone who came of age in the 60s or 70s. This is the opposite of what was supposed to happen. So, couldn't agree more.
So for Dr. Muñoz, we had a question come in about the recent activities regarding the Satanic Temple cases and what their implications might be for religious liberty as it relates to non-Christian groups.
I want to say I plead the fifth. No, I'm unfamiliar with the Satanic Temple events. So, Judge, do you know, or Brian, do you know? I just don't. I'm not aware of.
I just know headlines, and that's about it.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I should know about these things. I just don't.
Well, then we'll pass. I'm interested to know. I mean, and we're running out of time. Kind of as this session is titled, looking ahead to the future. Where do you see the country 10 years from now? Specifically with you, Dr. Muñoz, where do you see it in terms of religious freedom issues, legal issues? And Tom, where do you see it in terms of civic charity that you invoked?
Boy, that's a big question. And I mean, the judge started off his comments on a note of pessimism. And unfortunately, I'm pretty pessimistic. Let me not end that way. I have great faith in the American people, actually. I think most Americans in the heartland, on the coast, most Americans are actually very sensible, and they have a live and let live attitude. If they're religious or not religious, they're relatively respectful of religious freedom. I think our elites on both sides are the most polarized. And so I guess, I'll cast my lot with the American people. I had hopes that President Biden would be the moderate figure that he presented himself to be during that campaign. And I still have hopes he'll move that way. He hasn't really been governed as a moderate, but maybe he will. I think that's kind of where he is as a person. So that's maybe naive or unduly optimistic, but the more we just let the American people govern themselves, the better off we'll be. And so I'm, to the extent that one can be hopeful, it's really not in our elites. It's with everyday Joe and Jane American that I still think are full of common sense.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, hope is a choice, and I'm going to make it, but I'm not optimistic. Although what's the famous quote attributed to Yogi Berra, right? So he probably never said it, but I'm not very good at predictions, especially about the future, you know. So, but I'll make one here. I am pretty optimistic that this Supreme Court cares, it understands religious liberty and cares about it. And it's not just the, not just the typical conservative versus liberal bent. I think almost all the justices have some sense of the importance of religious liberty. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about that. On the larger issue of American culture, I'm less optimistic. The discussion is just so toxic. Now, maybe Professor Muñoz is right, though. I think only 6 or 7 million people watch cable, right? But that's the problem. There's the problem, right? And so I'll end with this exhortation. Sorry, Kiana, I'm going over time. In the penalty period, if your primary source of information is from social media or particularly cable, you're being played. Particularly if it's cable, you're being played. I mean, no, there are algorithms that figure out how to get you to watch. And Arthur Brooks calls this the outrage industrial complex. They know that if they create a sense of outrage, you'll watch, and that's cable's business model. So if you're buying into that, you're being played. The bad news is, to stay informed, you have to read, and it takes a long time. It's not easy. Citizenship's not an easy thing. So I guess, Brian, I'm not particularly hopeful because that's really hard work, and it seems that most of the political leaders, most of the dynamism is towards polarization and misinformation, and we're living in when 75% of Republicans believe the election was stolen. 44% of people in Utah believe that. Those are damning statistics that hopefully we can remedy, but I'm not too terribly optimistic unless we draw upon the history of civic charity and let that form our political allegiances and views. Way over time. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Dr. Muñoz, anything you'd like to add before we close?
Oh, not at all. Just thank you to UVU, the program in constitutional studies. Really, these conversations are really important. So thank you very much for your leadership on this.
Well, many thanks to both of you. And again, as we close out this event, I just want to personally thank my colleagues and friends at the Center for Constitutional Studies for their hard work, their interest in cultivating dialogue across difference. And I look forward to working with them here at UVU. And as we move forward, look forward to seeing many of you who are watching here today, hopefully in person, so that we can regain that human contact that many of us long for. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Kiana.
Thank you. What an informing and inspiring session, and what an outstanding finale to our conference. I express sincere appreciation to our outstanding speakers and moderator. I invite them to join the post-session breakout room at this time. This concludes our conference. We hope you have enjoyed the proceedings. Scott Paul, our interim director and executive director of the UVU Center for Constitutional Studies, will offer a few concluding remarks.
Thank you, Kiana. And again, thank you to the outstanding speakers and moderators who have joined us for this session and throughout the conference. We've been well informed. We've been well informed. We've heard compelling cases for various religious liberty perspectives, and hopefully we've developed new insights and enhanced our own perspectives. As we close this conference, I must thank Carrie Dennis, our events and marketing manager. Carrie and her team have seen to all the publicity and logistics for this conference, and they're the ones producing the online sessions. So thank you to them. Finally, I invite you to join us again for future events here at the Center for Constitutional Studies. You can learn about our events at our website, uvu.edu/CCS, or by following our social media accounts at CCSUVU and at CCS for Students. That second account is specifically targeted at undergraduate and high school students. Again, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to being with you again.